Hello everybody, this is Gregory of 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about the decline of the Society of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut in principio et nunc et semper et saecula saeculorum. Amen. So I'll make sure I put a banner in for our playlist on Catholic history. I think by now there's probably a good 40 videos there. So if you like Catholic history, this is one of those that would be included in there. Now, the Society of Jesus, as many of you Catholics know, was founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. I have been fortunate to have gone to Loyola. It's in the Basque region of Spain. I spent a summer in San Sebastian, Spain, way back in 1985 in college. And I was not far from Loyola, his hometown, so I went over there, and there's a beautiful church. And I've also been to the church in Rome, the Jesuit church, which is, Baroque, beyond Baroque, beautiful. I went to a Jesuit high school in Houston, graduated there, and so I do have an affinity to the Jesuits. And for many of you who might not know this, the Jesuits were so pivotal in the Counter-Reformation. St. Ignatius of Loyola, you look at Francis Xavier, you look at the period of the Jesuits. It is fortuitous. If you know the story about St. Ignatius, he was a soldier, he got injured, and then he kind of had this experience. He wrote the spiritual exercises, and he decided to create this order, and it just grew and grew and grew and grew. And in the first 100, 200 years, the Jesuits were like the army of the Pope, so to speak, and they were so instrumental in reclaiming much of Central Europe, which had fallen the way to Protestantism. So if you look at Bohemia, you look at Moravia, you look at Poland, Czech Republic area, this area, they were instrumental, and not necessarily like in arms and swords, but just theologically, just going in evangelically and bringing this land back to Holy Mother Church. Not to mention, if you look at the Jesuits, and we really haven't had an episode on science and the idea that the church is against science, but if you look in the 1600s, 1700s, the leading scientists were Jesuits. The Jesuits were the leading scholars. And later on, their charism, so to speak, is education. They're known for creating Jesuit high schools and universities, most famously in America. Loyola, for example, would be a Jesuit high school, or Jesuit college, I should say, and a Jesuit high school. And they have Jesuit universities scattered throughout the world. And they were exceedingly important and exceedingly useful and powerful order. And I think most people today don't have an idea of the complete free fall that the Society of Jesus is in terms of its numbers and in terms of its prestige. Now, in the late 1700s, kind of after its 200-year peak, the Society of Jesus was pretty powerful, and there were a lot of Catholic monarchs that expelled them out. Now, we're really not going to spend much time on why that happened. Most of it was political. If you look at Protestant conspiracy theories, they always find like the Jesuits were responsible for killing Abraham Lincoln, and the Jesuits are behind pretty much every machination, cabal, and conspiracy there is in American history. The head of the Jesuits is the Black Pope. He wears all black and all these things. But either way, all these countries brought them back. It was really kind of the Enlightenment. A lot of these monarchs were Enlightenment, and they wanted to get rid of the Jesuits. But once the Restoration came after Napoleon was deposed, and a lot of the old monarchs came back, the Jesuits were brought back. And again, the Jesuits were very useful in educating Catholic young and leading scientists, leading theologians, and so forth. And then what happened was the 20th century. So it really started kind of in the mid-20th century, but certainly with Vatican II, you did have a lot of leading theologians that were Jesuits, and they were pushing kind of the modernist push that Pius X, he warned us about 50 years earlier. And then they really embraced, especially in Latin America, liberation theology. We have an episode here on liberation theology. I'll make sure I put a banner here for that episode. And liberation theology is this Marxist nonsense. And so the Jesuits, in many ways, got co-opted by the left, the Catholic left, the intellectual left. A great book on this that was written back in the 80s was by Malachi Martin. Some of you might know Malachi Martin because he's most famous for writing Vatican, the novel, and Windswept House. He has a movie on exorcisms, or I'm sorry, a book on exorcisms called Hostage to the Devil. He has a very prolific author. He was a Jesuit as well. And he was definitely making the rounds on Art Bell and other kind of like what we would call today Alex Jonesian conspiracy radio and so forth, and talked about some of the issues that were going on in the church. But Malachi Martin has a book on the Jesuits where he really fleshes this out. And certainly there's been work since then on the fall of the Jesuits. And the Jesuits, like we've seen with seminaries that embrace kind of modernist tilt, it's not surprising that the vocations dry up. And so the Jesuits are in a major problem. There are more retired or lapsed or defrocked Jesuits in North America than there are active Jesuits. And so I do want to glean from the Cardinal Newman Society. The Cardinal Newman Society is probably most famous for recommending universities to Catholic families that are actually still Catholic. So Notre Dame, Georgetown, the Loyolas, my alma mater, which I won't mention, would not be on this list. But they're most famous for giving like an annual list of like the legitimately Catholic universities. But I'm going to glean off of them. So it says, putting it all together, American Jesuits are still in a free fall. The CRARA reports that the number of Jesuits in the United States declined by more than half in just 25 years, from 4,800 in 1988 to 2,300 in 2013. Presented in 5-year increments, the data shows much sharper declines in the most two recent periods, 2003 to 2008 and 2008 to 2003. And then it continues that the average age of the current practicing Jesuit is 68 years old. So they're dying off. And they're really getting maybe 20 new novitiates or 20 new novitiates. These aren't even ordained. These are just novitiates pretty much every year. But that's not enough for North America. I mean, that would even be enough for the Jesuit high schools and the Jesuit universities. So they're having problems with vocations. And look, I mean, we've talked about it. We have an episode here on how to resolve the vocation crisis in America. And it's not surprising, like we've seen with the mainstream Protestant denominations like Methodism, Lutheranism, Episcopalianism, that once you start embracing the left and you start embracing the values of this world, you really don't represent a counter to the secular world. You're trying to adapt and co-opt the secular values, whether it be homosexual marriage or would it be female ordination or whatever it is. And so the people leave. The people have left in droves the mainline Protestant denominations and gone to either Baptist or mainline or evangelical megachurches or even ROCOR, Orthodox or Catholic. And you certainly see it even with more liberal Catholic dioceses, it's the same thing. They don't have a lot of vocations, but the traditional dioceses tend to have more vocations. Or even if you look at somebody like who has an abnormal, irregular relationship like the SSPX, they tend to have high vocations as well. So it's not surprising that the Jesuits, like a lot of institutions, got infiltrated. They got co-opted in the mid-20th century. And that led to them embracing and proclaiming things that were contrary to the teachings of the church. And then they got caught up in liberation theology. And then during the time of John Paul II, there was a lot of fighting. I know John Paul, if I remember correctly, excommunicated a couple of Jesuit theologians that were writing books that were just blasphemy and so forth. And now you see later on, 30, 40 years later, that the Jesuits are in free fall, even in comparing to other orders out there, the Dominicans and Franciscans. And certainly you can look at the Institute of Christ the King, you look at Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, the kind of Latin Mass orders. In terms of numbers, they're having much higher vocations than the Jesuits, which are probably, I'm not going to say the most important order of Catholic history, but one of the at least top 3 in terms of historical significance and what they have contributed to Christendom, to Catholicism, to the sciences, to the arts, to theology, to see this once august order that was so important to Catholicism to see it as the shambles of vestige it is sad. And there's going to be some traditionalist Catholics who be like, good, they embrace modernism and the radical left, good. Well, ultimately, it's not good for the church. What would be good for the church is what you do see in some dioceses who have cleaned out the seminaries, who have cleaned out this bogus postmodernist theology and resurrected these seminaries. And that's what we need. We don't need the Jesuits to go away. We need the Jesuits to find their bearings again. They were the bastion, they were the herald of orthodoxy in the 16th and 17th centuries and 18th centuries. And they've lost their way. And just like us, just like the prodigal son, just like our personal stories, a lot of us have lost our way. And we don't want people to just discard us. It's the same thing here. We want the Jesuits to find their way like the prodigal son and be the great champion of Catholicism that it once was. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Hit the notification, subscribe, and share button. Until next time, take care, God bless, and pray.